Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be continuing our exploration of the open Sicilian, and we're going to be looking at specifically like independent Lowenthal and Taimanov lines, and we're going to be looking at lines of a specific type of we'll call it a brand. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the variations that we're going to be starting with are going to go e4, c5, knight f3, and then we're going to say knight c6. Although we can reach these particular types of positions that we're going to be covering today from a number of different move orders. You can also reach these positions from e6 move orders, and you can also reach these positions from knight c6 followed by e6 or knight c6 followed by the e5 move order. We can reach this from a Taimanov move order or really a Lowenthal move order. And what I'm talking about specifically is the lines that are going to be independent of the Lasker Pelican that also don't fall into the category of, say, like a Paulson Kahn type position or a Queen c7, Knight c6 kind of hybrid Kahn-Taimanov independent line position. So I know this is confusing, but in my personal opinion, like the names of these particular openings, like the Taimanov, the Kalishnikov, the Lasker Pelican, the Lowenthal, etc., they're not really great names for categorizing how we're going to naturally memorize these openings. In my opinion, I think it falls into basically like three categories of openings, which is you have your mainline Lasker Pelican, which is going to be the majority of what you're going to be playing. And so look at my mainline Lasker Pelican video to check out the majority of what you're going to be playing. And then you're going to have kind of independent Kalishnikov, Taimanov, and Lowenthal lines where queens stay on the board, and independent Taimanov, Kalishnikov, and Lowenthal lines where queens get exchanged. And that's how I would catalog these positions into those three sets. So this is going to be independent Lowenthal, Kalishnikov, and Taimanov lines, to say that 10 times fast, where queens get exchanged. So we're going to be taking a look at d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6, and this is one of many ways to get to kind of where we're going, because I'm going to kind of shove these all into basically the same category. E5 is another possibility to kind of try to get the same type of position, although all these positions are going to be a little bit different. But we'll just go with one of the main ones here. E6, knight b5, and then we're going to have knight f6, knight on 1 to c3, and then bishop b4. And this will usually lead to kind of an early exchange of queens, or it'll lead to basically just kind of some type of endgame. And basically what Black's trying to do in these situations is he's making the argument that I can accept a certain number of weaknesses to solve my opening problems. So I can accept losing the bishop pair, I can accept an isolated queen pawn, just to solve all of my opening problems, get castled, simplify the position, and even though it's very clear that white is slightly better, there's no doubt about it, white's going to have fewer pawn islands, white's going to have better pawn islands, white's going to have better pieces, Black doesn't believe that white has enough to win. So this is not like an aggressive attempt by Black to play for a win at all, not on the highest levels anyway. Basically what it is it's saying, you don't have enough to beat me, we're just going to, I think that the position is equal. I personally don't like playing chess this way with Black. I think like if you want to play for a draw, I mean you could just play the Petrovs. It's giving up a lot less in terms of concessions. Here you're giving up a bishop pair and you're giving up a clear weakness on the d5 square in a lot of cases. So you're giving up clear weaknesses and clear concessions in these types of positions. So here we have bishop b4, and then we basically just continue with our next move here. We're going to play pawn to a3, and we're going to say, okay, if you want to give up a bishop pair so desperately, go ahead. So then we have bishop c3, knight captures c3, and then the usual move here is d5. Again, Black isn't caring so much about creating weaknesses. He's just trying to simplify his major opening problems, get all of his pieces out, get castled, and call it a day. So we're going to have e takes d5, and then the normal here is knight takes d5, although e takes d5 is also possible with very similar types of positions. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop d3, and then queen e7. It's very common for queens to get exchanged here. It's of course also possible to keep queens on the board with castles kingside for white. And in these cases, white has a little bit more to work with if the queens manage to stay on the board. So queen e7, queen e2, and then we're going to exchange queens, and kind of both moves have been played here. We've had king takes e2 get played. We've also had bishop takes e2 get played. Both are possible. So like one example is bishop f5, and then interestingly enough, like the best move, or one of the best moves that's playable here is probably just bishop d1, although king d2 has been played in the past as well. So I mean, it's kind of an open debate is which direction to go here with white. Although, whatever direction you do go, it is really clear that white has the advantage here. We have an isolated d-pawn, and we have a very clear bishop pair for white. We have healthier pawn structures. We have our 2 pawn islands versus black's 3 pawn islands. And needless to say, white should be able to play for a win from here under a number of different conditions. The games that get played from here are typically very long. I've got a win in here that went 92 moves between Bologan and Popov, played in Bulgaria in 2012. That was in the king d2 line with rook c8 and then bishop d1, and he managed to eventually unravel all of this and start trying to squeeze for a win with the white pieces. But it was a very, very long game. So these positions are very difficult to win with the white pieces. Once you get a lot of pieces off the board, taking advantage of 2 very minor weaknesses, the weakness on d5 and the fact that you have a bishop pair, is actually quite difficult, but white's going to be playing for 2 results for the rest of the game, so as people playing the white pieces, we should be very willing to accept this. If somebody offers us an advantage in the opening, we should take it, and that's just always been my personal opinion on these independent lines. Now, there's a number of different ways that people try to do basically this same idea, bishop b4 just being one of them. Another way that people can do this is they can, of course, play the move e5, and this is going about it via like the Lasker-Pelikan type of move order, or we could call this an independent Lowenthal line, because if you haven't played knight f6, these positions are cataloged as the Lowenthal, which again, I think is kind of an insufficient way of describing everything, because normally people will end up playing knight f6 anyway, in which case you've transposed back into a Lasker-Pelikan. So when we start cataloging these openings in our head, it's hard to keep track of it all if we're going with kind of the traditional opening names. So like I said, I just kind of keep it in those 3 categories. Lasker-Pelikan, and then independent lines of Lowenthal, Kalishnikov, Taimanov with queens on the board, independent lines of Lowenthal, Kalishnikov, Taimanov with queens off the board. So we'd have knight b5 here, and then we would have a6, and this is basically to get queens off the board. If we wanted to play an independent Lowenthal or Kalishnikov lines with queens on the board, we would play d6 here. And now we're going to play knight d6, bishop d6, queen d6, and then this is the normal. They're going to play something like queen f6 to try to exchange queens right away. So this queen exchange happens, knight c3, and this is basically the same type of thing. We've exchanged off the bishop pair, and in exchange, black is going to accept some weaknesses in the middle as well, because the normal move here, just to eliminate the main weakness on d5, is black will usually play d5 right away to try to eliminate that serious weakness, the d5 square. So then e5, and then knight b4, and now bishop d3 holding c2, because black was threatening a beginner fork, and we needed to block that. So now black can get his bishop pair back, but then he's going to temporarily be down a pawn, and white is going to have more space. So this can lead to an advantage for white if black chooses to take the bishop pair here. So if he plays knight d3, e3, bishop f5, white kind of has 2 moves. One move worked out really well in Contronius versus Bagturov in 1995, and that move was just simply castle's kingside. So an idea of what would take place here is, let's say castle's queenside, bishop g5, bishop d3, rook e1. We would just bring both rooks to the open files, and white has a very simple slight edge here. We're going to play f3, and we've got a nice edge because this king is really loose, we've got a lot of extra space, and we've got a lot of different weaknesses that we can attack and kind of poke at. So the main idea here is eventually we're going to play f4, and that's going to kind of lead to black feeling the need to capture that pawn because we were threatening to create 2 very dangerous pawns in the middle of the board. And then once these exchanges happen, this pawn, specifically this d pawn, becomes very, very dangerous, and it becomes very difficult to stop. So after all of this stuff happens, this pawn becomes a serious problem. You can see with everything coming into this position, this pawn is doing a major service to white's position. So we have h6, we have d6, and then we have knight b6, we have h4, and eventually black feels the urge to get rid of this pawn, but it leads to a disaster. Rook d1, and then knight d5, and then we have knight back to e3, and black had to resign because everything's hanging. The bishop on the knight on d6 is hanging from the bishop and the rook, and when it moves, the bishop on f5 is hanging. So these are the types of difficulties that white can create for black. I would also note that I would say if we go all the way back to where we had this main variation stem off here with bishop f5. Another very interesting attempt is something like f4. Now, this move hasn't actually been played at the very highest levels. I've played it a lot in my personal blitz games, so that's about all I can say for it. But the computer does like it, and it's basically the same idea of what happened in this Contronius game, where Contronius eventually played f4. We're just doing it right away. We're trying to obligate black to take this pawn. And of course, actually, black shouldn't take this pawn. And if he takes this pawn right away, this is going to lead to actually major advantage white, kind of with the same idea of just creating this super dangerous pawn as quickly as possible after something like this. And this super dangerous passed d pawn would just dominate the game after this, and this is already almost +2 according to the engine. So this is major advantage white. So playing f4 immediately is another way to go. So, like I said before, there's numerous ways that people can attempt to do this thing, where they give up the bishop pair and exchange queens, or exchange queens or give up the bishop pair, and try to just say that you don't have enough to win the endgame. So another move order that they can do this with is they can do this with just immediately, let's say, a6. They can just say, okay, go in there, and then we're going to play queen e7, and we're going to exchange queens. And this is going to be pretty similar to, and actually it can even directly transpose. So like you can have something like this, queen e7 here, and then we can play knight to c3, and we can have something very similar to the previous lines, where we have knight to b4, we have bishop d3, and then we even have d5, and we can even have direct transpositions. So we can do something like d5, e d5, knight b5, takes. And we're going to have a direct transposition, or something close to a direct transposition, to a line that we would see out of that Lowenthal variation, with the only difference being that the pawn was, in that variation, was going to be on e5 instead of e6. But basically, it's going to essentially be the exact same position. So if we go back to that original Lowenthal position, where we have something like knight to b5 after the Lowenthal move order, and the Lowenthal move order is going to be e5. So you can kind of see why I think of all of these as almost the same type of position, because they're so similar. You know, it just, the idea is the same. We're going to have the queens off the board, bishop pair's gone, but you know, in some cases there's a pawn on e5, in some cases there's a pawn on e6, and from a practical perspective, there just isn't much of a difference to that. So we have something like a6. We do something like this. We go back to this line. After d5 takes, bishop d3. It is possible for them to simply take on d5. This is also really common. And then the move I actually recommend here is not the most common move that's played. I actually recommend just playing the move pawn to a3. And I think the most common move here is actually bishop d2. So sort of the idea of doing the exact same thing as what I'm doing, but doing it with a bishop instead of doing it with a pawn. I prefer doing it with a pawn, again, because my intention is to just kind of leave the bishop on c1 and just play f4 eventually. And in order to do that, I would rather just prevent knight to b4 mechanically by just playing pawn to a3. But I think both attempts are legitimate, but I prefer a3 just because it's lesser known. So it immediately gets my opponent kind of into their own territory. And there's also a little bit of poison here. So like if they play bishop e6, I could castle, and then I could put immediate pressure on this e5 pawn. And already black is in trouble because it's difficult to hold this pawn. So like if you were to play f6, then now I would play f4 with just a very simple effect of winning an entire pawn. So here white would just be up not just the bishop pair, but he would also just be winning an entire pawn in this position. And of course, you know, white would have a huge advantage here. So one other independent line that I want to mention, just because it is extremely tricky and it does come up, is let's say knight b5, we have knight f6, knight c3. It's also possible for people to play bishop c5 here. Now, there's two ways that you can approach this, and I don't want to necessarily sell you on either one of them. I personally think that right now, according to theory, the best move according to theory is just to play bishop f4. And of course, if you want to, this can actually lead to very similar types of positions as the other positions mentioned, because in some of the main lines here, we are going to exchange queens. So like, for example, castles, we could simply play bishop c7, queen e7, bishop back to d6, and you can see where this is going. We simply exchange queens, and we would have a normal position, and if they avoid the queen exchange with queen d8, we would have some sort of advantage with castles, queenside a6, knight d4, knight e7, and then we could simply play h4. And this would be advantage white. It's very difficult for black to finish his development. White has more space, and white has a grip on this weak square on d6. Otherwise, we're just going to be exchanging queens in this position with something like queen d6, knight d6, and that's obviously a very nice position for white as well. It is also possible to play this a little bit differently. Like, instead of bishop c7, a move that was essayed by Daniil Dubov was the move pawn to e5, and this was Dubov versus Basno in Skopje in 2019. So relatively recently, and he had a barn burner of a game that just went really, really well for white. That game continued a6, knight d6, takes, queen takes, and already we could say that white's has a massive advantage, especially after black's next move, queen b6. Dubov just calculated very accurately and realized that he could simply take this knight. And then after queen captures b2, he simply played king to d2, offering up the rook on a1. And what this amounts to is a direct refutation of black's entire plan here. Black is dead at this point. He had to take the rook on a1, and then we had bishop h6, which, again, if you're Daniil Dubov, these moves are apparently easy to see. You can't play g6 because queen f8 is mate. You can't play gh6 because queen g7 is mate. So that just doesn't leave a whole lot. We had to play rook e8. We have f captures g7. Again, threatening mate. We're threatening queen f8, rook f8, g f8 equals mate. So knight e7 is forced. And then we have pawn to g4, the best move, because Dubov is just a machine. And then we have a5, and then we have bishop g2. So this is the idea, is to retrap this queen, queen b2, rook b1. As you can see, this queen has nowhere to go. So he's not just got threats against the king, he's now trapping this queen, and the queen has nowhere to go. And after rook a6, it looks like the queen has to give up control of that square, and that this queen is no longer trapped, but Dubov has the move queen g3, which X-ray protects the a3 square. So if his opponent had tried to escape with queen e3, he had knight e4, threatening the queen and threatening mate. So after queen g3, knight f6 would be mate, for example. So the queen would have to be lost in this position. We would just have to defend the mate threat, and we would just play queen captures queen, winning the game. So Dubov's opponent gave up his queen, and he played on a few more moves, but he's down an entire queen, and Dubov went on to it very easily. So that's probably, I mean, to be completely honest, I would say right now, bishop to f4, and then after castles, e5, this is probably the best way to go until kind of we're told otherwise, against this bishop c5 idea, is basically just to try to refute this idea directly with bishop c5 and knight d6. But all of these ideas, whether they play them with pawn to e5 or whether they play them with pawn to e6, all of these ideas are going to be about the same. Black is going to be giving up the bishop pair. Black is going to be trying to exchange queens early. And black is just basically going to be saying, okay, my position is a little bit worse, but you shouldn't have enough in this position to get any type of advantage. So one last little independent line, just because I know it does come up, is something like this, and then we'll go back into this line for a second. Takes, takes, and then we have something like d5, we have takes, and then we'll have takes, and then we're going to have bishop to d3, and then we're going to have d4 here. So the little lesson that I've kind of learned in these situations is knight e4 right away is kind of a mistake. Basically what white should be doing is white should be playing queen e2 check first, and then just kind of going from there. So basically, the lesson is always going to just kind of be about the same, is white is not afraid of exchanging queens in any of these variations. White's completely okay with it. We're just going to play with an extra bishop pair, and we're going to play with some weaknesses in black's camp, and that's going to be okay. And that's going to be true in these e6 lines. It's also going to be true in these e5 lines, whether it comes out of the Lowenthal move order or the Lasker-Pelikan move order. basically all of these different openings are basically trying to accomplish the same thing. Black is just trying to play with a slight disadvantage where he feels like white doesn't quite have enough to win. And I think we should accept the slight disadvantage and we should just press. Whenever you get an opportunity to play for 2 results out of the opening, I would recommend it. It's something that Black can force if he wants to out of really just about any opening. But I don't think this is something that we should shy away from with the white pieces. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.